Homework 19, Basic Principles of Hypothesis Testing, Video 6, Types of Errors. In the previous video, when we talked about the two decisions you can make, which are reject the null or do not reject the null, I mentioned that rejecting a null hypothesis doesn't mean it's true. Rejecting a null hypothesis doesn't mean it's false. And not rejecting it doesn't mean it's true. It's just a conclusion drawn based on the evidence provided by the sample. So it follows that when conducting a hypothesis test, you can make errors in your conclusions. There are two types of errors in hypothesis testing. They have very clever names, type 1 error and type 2 error. A type 1 error is when you reject a true null hypothesis. I know some of you are laughing at reading this sentence because you're reading this word as something besides null hypothesis. But a type 1 error is when you reject a true null hypothesis. No, reject me, I'm true. Sorry, the evidence suggests otherwise. But I'm innocent, and this evidence says you're guilty. A type 2 error is when you do not reject a false null hypothesis. In other words, your null hypothesis is false, but you end up not rejecting it. In other words, you're guilty, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict you. There's a way you can organize the types of errors in a little table. The types of errors are based on what you do to the null hypothesis. So you either reject the null or you do not reject the null, compared to whether or not it's actually true. So the null is true or the null is false. First, let's find the decisions that are correct. If you were to reject the null hypothesis correctly, it's because it was false. So rejecting the null when the null is false is a correct decision. You are supposed to reject it if it's false, or rather your evidence should have suggested you should reject it. Where's the other correct decision? Well, if the null hypothesis is true, you don't want to reject it. So not rejecting the null hypothesis when it's true is the correct decision. But what about the other two combinations? If it's true, but you reject it anyway, that's a type 1 error. Type 1 error. But if the null is false and you fail to reject it, that's a type 2 error. In theory, we want to avoid making these errors, but we can never guarantee it because you can never 100% know the value of some population parameters. Because populations are either too large or dynamic in the sense that they're always changing. Over here we have some examples of some hypotheses and some decisions, and although I didn't write the question is what type of error was made, or did we make the correct decision? So our hypothesis is a population mean is equal to 50,000 as the null. The alternative is, no, we say it's more than 50,000. So let's take a look at part A. The mean is 50,000, and we reject the null. Well, if the mean is 50,000, if it really is, that means that this is true. But if we reject a true null hypothesis, that's a type 1 error. It was 50,000, but we rejected the claim that it was 50,000. Let's look at part B. The mean is actually 55,000, and we reject the null. Well, if the mean is 55,000, then the null is false, and we should reject it. So rejecting a false null hypothesis is a correct decision. But what about part C? What if the mean actually is 55,000 and we do not reject the null? Well, if the mean is 55,000, then the null hypothesis is false. if we do not reject a null hypothesis, if we do not reject a false null hypothesis, that's a type 2 error. So when you're determining what type of error has been made, it all boils down to, is the null hypothesis true or false? And did we make the correct decision based on it? If it's false and we rejected it, that was the right decision. If it's true and we didn't reject it, that was also the right decision. However, if the null was true but we rejected it anyway, we made a type 1 error. And if the null was false but we didn't reject it, that was a type 2 error.